Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm once again here in collaboration with Chip Theory Games to bring you a Gearloc guide. Today I'm going to be talking about Static, who is one of the add-on Gearlocs released alongside the Unbreakable expansion. Static is a peaceful warrior. In other words, he is calm and meditative, but still waters run deep. He's also building up the power to kick baddie butt. Let's learn how to work with this mysterious Gearloc. So, as usual, I've started with Static's stuff all out and ready to go. We have his Gearloc mat, we have his chip, and then these are 2 Electrify chips, which I'm going to teach you how to use. We have his dice, we have his reference sheet, and we have a sample battle mat with a sample baddie on it. And of course, this is the lovely, different battle mat from Unbreakable with a baddie from Unbreakable, a bridge troll. So as usual, Static has his Gearloc information up here on the left with his starting stats, his professions, he's a melee fighter, and he has an innate ability called Meditative Warrior with an innate +1 called Meditative Master. So this and the first several skills of Static I'm going to be talking about are actually described in detail on the back of the Gearloc reference sheet. If you want to kind of read along with me, pause, hear me talk, read a little bit, this is where you should be. But first, let's just talk about his innate ability, which is very cool. So Meditative Warrior allows Static, after each recovery phase, to roll 3 defense dice from the supply. Then he can add all bones that are rolled to his backup plan, and then return the rest to the supply. So that means that he can start the next battle with some bones already in his backup plan, ready to use, which is something that no other Gearloc gets to do. So for Meditative Warrior, you only get to roll 3 of those defense dice. When you get to innate +1, Meditative Master, then Static is able to roll 5 defense dice after the recovery phase instead of just 3. So basically, if things go well, you can start with a lot of bones already in your plan, already ready to go. So in addition to having a cool innate ability, Static also starts with 3 dice on his Gearloc mat that are very interesting. So I'm going to put them out, tell you what they are. We're going to go through them one by one. So probably Static's most important die is Inner Peace, which is a counter, so you don't roll it. It's a counter that you put out on the Gearloc mat, and it starts out set to 0. The next die in this profession, Transcendence, is also a counter, and it also starts at 0, but I'm, of course, about to show you how to change that. There's a third counter that is also Static's only consumable that starts down here at the bottom. That is Knuckle Zappers, and those also go on the mat with a value of 0. So these are counters that we're going to manipulate, and they are truly the foundation of everything else that Static can do. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about his breathing tutor profession. These counters, a third counter you can train, and then Knuckle Zappers before we get into anything else. So let's go ahead and start with the foundation of it all. That's Inner Peace. Static has an Inner Peace die that, as we mentioned, is a counter that starts set to 0 on his mat. And this is a die that does not reset between days. It just constantly ticks up or down if you decide to tick it down. So how do we increase the Inner Peace die? Static increases this die by 1 at the end of every single turn where he rolls no attack dice. So your Inner Peace increases by not attacking. There are going to be some skills that do allow you to do damage anyway, so it's okay, I promise. If you want to increase your Inner Peace die by 2, then on your turn, you should roll nothing except for defense dice. So the only way to increase this die is to not roll certain types of dice. If you want to just tick it up by 1, don't roll any attack. If you want to tick it up by 2, only roll defense. So why would you be doing that? Why would you limit yourself in this way? Well, you're going to find out throughout the course of this video, but by decreasing Inner Peace, there are a couple things you can do. So at the start of Static's turn, you have the option of decreasing this counter by any amount that's available on the die, and that amount is added to your dex for the turn. So what that means is that if you have 3 stored up on your Inner Peace die, and you just decrease it down to 0 at the start of your turn, you'd have 3 dexterity plus whatever you already have from your actual stat. So this is a die that allows Static to take these enormous turns. As long as he times them correctly, they can be tremendously damaging. The other thing that Static can do at any point on his turn is decrease this die by 3. And when he decreases Inner Peace by 3, he increases Transcendence by 1. And this is the only way to tick up that Transcendence die, and you're going to need to tick it up. So a lot of this game for Static is going to be getting Inner Peace high enough to spend off of it to bring Transcendence up, and then you spend Transcendence to do even more cool stuff. So essentially, Inner Peace forces you to avoid attacking in order to store up some crazy extra dex, or to put it into Transcendence, which then powers some more incredible effects. Transcendence, as we've been talking about, also starts on Static's mat. It's set to 0. And this die can only be increased in one way, by getting Inner Peace up to 3, and then spending those 3 to increase Transcendence by 1. However, once you've got some Transcendence, it does some very cool things. For example, Static can decrease this die by 1 during his turn to unexhaust any skill die that is in his exhausted area. So if you rolled your best die and exhausted it already, if you have a little bit of Transcendence, you can spend it in order to get that die back into the action. The other thing that this die can do is he can decrease it by 2 to remove 1 status effect die from himself. Which means that if you're poisoned, or if you have a bleed effect, or something that you don't want, you can use Transcendence to make it go away. This die can also be used multiple times per turn, as long as you can decrease it by the appropriate amount. So if you're maxed out, you could spend it all in any configuration of ways, as long as you have the amount to spend. And even though I normally wouldn't do this, I do want to go ahead and talk about Perseverance. So Inner Peace and Transcendence start on Static's mat. Perseverance is a die that you have to train, but I want to talk about it now because it's also a counter, and it kind of works with the others in a way that has so much synergy that I just can't bear to leave it out right now. So Perseverance is a major part of Static's offense strategy. So he's trying not to attack, he can remove things from himself, but how does he do damage? Perseverance is one of the interesting ways for Static to do that. Perseverance is a counter that also enters Static's mat at 0, and the way that this one works is that on each turn, when a baddie attacks Static and then it reduces his defense by at least 1, Perseverance is going to increase by 1. So as Static keeps getting hit and his defenses erode, Perseverance continues to tick up every time someone attacks him and he loses some defense. Then, once Static has saved up a bit of Perseverance, then at the start of his next turn, Static can choose to decrease this die by any amount, and then he can gain the amount on here in temporary attack stat for this turn. So you still need Dex to use that attack, but if you're pairing it with Inner Peace, which stores Dexterity, then you can store up a bunch of Perseverance, get Inner Peace really high, roll a ton of attack dice, and then use Inner Peace to pay the Dex that you need to actually roll them. So these work together in these really interesting ways that make Static seem a little bit slow on that first turn, but then once you've saved up some power, he's terrifying in a good way. The other counter that we absolutely must talk about, because other skills do contribute to it, is Static's Knuckle Zappers. So this is his only consumable, and I typically save consumables for the end of a Gearloc guide, but we're going to talk about him now because he really needs this consumable and uses it in interesting ways. So these Knuckle Zappers are connected to these 2 Electrify chips that Static comes with, and I'm going to show you how they work, because there are going to be other skills that mention an electrified baddie, and if you don't know how to electrify someone, well, that's no fun. So as usual, these Knuckle Zappers start at 0. They are a counter. So there are 2 ways to make this tick up. One is to use Energize in the backup plan, which we'll get to later. And then Static can also use a Fortunate Discovery loot to increase Knuckle Zappers up to their max. And this is a die that you use at the end of Static's turn. So at the end of his turn, Static can decrease this die by any number that he wants that's available on the die to electrify his target, as long as it is not a tyrant. So any non-tyrant baddie is fair game for this. If you electrify a baddie, that means that you're placing one of these electrify chips into its health stack, and the number that you decrease this die by is the number of chips up into the health stack that you place it. And this is important because when you take health off of your baddies, at least typically people do this, and technically this is how it's supposed to work, you take a chip off the bottom of the baddie and you leave everything in place. So basically what you're trying to do is stick that Electrify chip as far up into the baddie's health stack as possible, because when there aren't any more HP chips under it, then the baddie's no longer electrified and the effects of electrification no longer work. So let's just do a quick Electrify demo, and then we can talk about what Electrify does just at its base. So let's say that I have got my Knuckle Zappers up to 3, and I've got this little bridge troll, and I want to electrify this sucker. So I can decrease this by 1, 2, or 3, because I have 3 on the counter. If I choose to just go down to 2, then I can take this chip and basically just place it 1 from the bottom. So it's going to look like this, where I have 3 health chips on top, then the electrified chip, and then 1 more red on the bottom. That's because I only spent 1 off of the die in order to put this in the stack. If I spent all 3 and went all the way down to 0, then I'm going to put that electrified chip 1, 2, 3 HP chips up into the Bridge Troll's health stack. So basically I have more time for this baddie to remain electrified, because once these chips are taken off, then the electrified chip is returned to me and the baddie's not electrified anymore. So the motivation to spend a bunch off your Knuckle Zappers each time you electrify somebody is to make it last longer by pushing that electrified chip further up the health stack. So the other benefit to that is if this baddie is just sitting out here being electrified, there's some skills that are going to interact with that. But also, while a baddie is electrified, its attack stat is reduced by 1. And also, anytime it's dealt attack damage, it deals 1 damage to a different baddie who is adjacent, if possible. So I'm not going to bother to put any health on him, but like, let's say that this Orc Rager is out on the mat. If this troll is electrified and gets attacked and damaged, then he's going to take some damage and he's going to do 1 more to this orc. Other than that, HP is just removed from electrified baddies as normal. So truly the goal is to just get that electrified chip as high up the stack as possible so it stays as long as possible. And that actually covers Static's first profession, which is Breathing Tutor, and also his consumable, which means that we're going to spend the rest of the video looking at his other dice and figuring out how they interact with these counters that are so crucial to Static strategy. So all dice are depicted on the front if you want to see all of their different sides. As you can see, Inner Peace, Transcendence, and Perseverance all have the same faces, just with different numbers. And that's also true for Knuckle Zappers. Now, however, we're going to get into Static's next profession, which is called Brawler. And this basically manipulates baddies and does some crowd control for Static and for his friends if you're playing co-op. The starting skill in this profession is called Sibron Style. So let's go ahead and have a quick look at that die. So as usual, Sibron Style has a lovely little bones face. In fact, it has 2 of them. And then aside from that, it's going to have this wavy line symbol with either a 1 or 5 in the top right-hand corner. And basically what this does is it allows you to take a turn for a baddie with this number of points or less without moving it. So the last time that we had an example of taking a turn for a baddie was back in the video about Stanza. And there are just a couple of things to remember when you do this. The first is that this die has an immediate effect. It's not something that you use later, it's something that you do right now. And that means that you are essentially taking an extra turn for the baddie. The baddie will still get its own turn and operate according to its AI when its initiative comes up on the initiative meter. So this is like an extra turn that you can use to make a baddie beat up on one of its friends, for example, which is exactly what we would do here. So if we roll this die result, then we can take a turn immediately for a 1-point baddie. Fortunately, our little bridge troll is a 1-point baddie. And let's say that he's hanging out with an Orc Rager. If Static rolls this die and wants to take an immediate turn for the bridge troll, he does have some limitations because he can't move it. However, he can choose to roll as many of this baddie's dice and skills as he wants. So in this case, I might choose to ignore a defense die, but roll an attack die against this neighboring Orc Rager. So in that case, I could choose not to move him, roll this die for him. Haha, he did a damage to his friend. That damage is taken off. And then the turn I took for the baddie would be over. So when you're taking a turn for a baddie, the main thing to remember is you do it immediately. You follow whatever restrictions are here. And then that doesn't mean that the baddie's already taken its turn for this round. What it means is that you took an immediate extra turn for that baddie that you controlled, and then the baddie will just proceed as usual the next time it comes up in the initiative meter. So that is Sibron Style. Next, we have a cool die called Shock Kick that we're going to look at. So as usual, we have a bones face. There's only 1 on this die. And then you're going to have a cool image of somebody doing a kick with the numbers 1, 2, or 3 in the bottom left corner, depending on the die face that you roll. So what Shock Kick does is it lets you deal the number on the die worth of damage to each adjacent baddie. However, there are also sides that have a bleed effect symbol. If you roll this, you still do this number of damage to each adjacent baddie, but on this result, you do also add a bleed effect die to yourself. So maybe you like overclocked it a little bit, but don't forget, if you have Transcendence stored up, you can decrease it to remove a status effect die from yourself. So if you've always got a little bit of it stored up, then you can do something like this, get a bleed effect, and then just take it right off. So bleed can stink, but it's really not as bad as it seems when you are static. So that is Shock Kick. And let's just continue down the row. We've got Marked for Death. Never have so many bones seem so apropos as on a die called Marked for Death, but you have 3 different faces that have 2 bones on them. Then you also have 3 faces that have this creepy skull with a number in the top right corner. So 2 of those faces will have a 1 in the top right, and then the last one will have a 5, and of course that's the best roll. So Marked for Death is basically a die that goes on a baddie. You place it on a baddie with this point value or less, and then all other baddies now treat that baddie as an opposing unit. So once you place this on a baddie, all of his friends will turn on him and be like, "You traitor," and they will treat him just as if he was a Gearloc like you and attack him and do all sorts of terrible things. It's very fun to watch. So that is Marked for Death. Now we have one more die in this profession called Out of Control. Let's see what happens when we get out of control, everyone. So the first face on here is, of course, a bones face. In fact, 2 of them are. It is too many bones after all. The next 3 faces are this kind of cool explosion symbol, and this stands for Enter the Gearloc. This is an active die. When you roll this result, you put it in your active slot, and you use it at the start of your turn. So once you use this, all attack dice that you roll this turn will deal 2 times the damage to your target. However, each bone you roll this turn causes you to be dealt 1 damage, so it's a bit of a blessing and a curse. There is a reason that Static needs so many defense dice and has to be able to take so many hits. But hey, being able to double all the attack damage for your turn is pretty darn good. This die also has a really nice locked face that's called Overcharge. This one means that electrified baddies are dealt +1 damage, so 1 additional damage each time they are attacked. And if you put this in your lock slot, it lasts the entire adventure. It also doesn't mean attacked by you. It just means each time that they're attacked. So this is a very sweet lock die to have if you can get it, especially if you are using your Knuckle Zappers to their greatest effect and electrifying as many baddies as possible. Because if you're good about that, then all those electrified baddies are going to keep taking additional damage, and that can be nothing but good for you. So that's Out of Control. I do want to note once again that locked face would go in a locked slot. Static only has 2 locked slots and a lot of really cool dice that you could lock. So definitely be aware, as you play, of what you really want from him, because you're going to have to make some really unpleasant choices about what you want to keep because there's just so much good stuff. So that is Static's Brawler profession. Now we're on to Static's 3rd profession, which is called Preservationist. And this profession is interesting because it basically triggers abilities based on movement, either yours or a baddie's. So the first die in this profession, the first one you can train, is called Owlbear Style. So let's figure out what Owlbear Style is. So there are no bones faces on this die, but instead you're going to get 3 different types of face. So we're going to talk about what they are. This first one is called Talon Strike, and there are 2 of them on this die. And it lets you deal a number of damage to your target that's equal to the number of positions that you've moved so far this turn. So if you want to use this one, you should definitely know where you started your move and how far you have come. Then you can turn that amount of movement into damage. The next symbol on here is called Hibernate. This one lets you heal a number of HP, again, that is equal to the number of positions that you've moved so far this turn. And then we've got Thick Hide, which lets you add a number of defense to your active slots equal to the number of positions you've moved so far this turn. So every skill on here is based on how far you moved. So let's say that I'm on this position and I roll Talon Strike. If I move 2 positions, and then this is the die roll that I get during my roll and resolve phase, then I'll be able to do 2 damage to the Bridge Troll. And that is Owlbear Style. So Owlbear Style is going to split into Owl Spin and Bear Spin for Owlbear. Get it? So let's talk about Owl Spin first. Owl Spin is a die that basically just has all these cute little owls on it, and every face is going to have a little number in the bottom left corner. It'll be a 2, a 3, or a 4. And what this face does is let you swap the positions of up to the number of baddies that's printed on the die face. It also allows you to select a new target. So you could do something with this die where you target one baddie, use this die to swap that baddie's positions with another baddie, and then switch targets and do more damage to somebody new all in the same turn, which is why Owl Spin is so interesting. So that's Owl Spin. And then next we've got Bear Spin. Bear Spin does have some bones faces, one side with 2 bones and another with 3. But then all the other faces are this image of a bear with a number in the bottom left, and the number will range from 1 to 3, and this bleed symbol. So what Bear Spin will do is it lets you place a bleed effect die on yourself and up to the number of adjacent baddies printed on the die. So this seems like a really risky thing to do. Bleed effects are no joke. They cause true damage to you at the start of every turn. However, because Static has his Transcendence die, that he can decrease by 2 to remove a status effect from himself. That means that he could, for example, use this die, put a bleed effect on a bunch of surrounding baddies, and then actually just decrease his Transcendence die to take the bleed effect off of himself and leave it on his enemies. So that is Bear Spin. And that whole thing is, again, the preservationist profession. And then our last profession is kinesiologist. And this profession also contains a lot of very interesting faces that are going to complement your other professions very well. So the very first here is the Way of the Gear, and that's die number 8. Let's have a look. So as is often the case, you're going to have a couple of bones faces on here, but there's some other interesting things to look at. This die face right here stands for Breakthrough. This can be used instantly or placed in an active slot. And when you use it, the skills on your non-tyrant baddie target are suspended for the remainder of your turn. So they're only suspended for your turn, but that does mean that you can cancel out things like Lashback or Hardy or Thick Skin and get around some of those status effects that protect enemies in annoying ways. There are also a couple of sides that will have this explosive looking fist on them. Those stand for Uppercut. That's also an instant or an active slot die. And when you use the die on this face, all attack damage that you deal to non-tyrant baddies is true damage for the remainder of your turn. So if you're going to do this, you want to damage as many baddies as possible using your skills, using your Owl Spin to switch baddies around, whatever you can possibly do to deal out as much true damage as you can. So that is Way of the Gear. Next, you can go down 2 different pathways. So let's go ahead and start with the left pathway, and then we'll do the right pathway. So let's go to Obendar Flow, and that's die number 11. Obendar Flow has an example of what you might have seen before with other Gearlocs, but this is the only die of Statics that does this. It has required bones. So these red bones that are filled in with red, it is absolutely required that you use them. You cannot decide to just put the die back in your skill slot and roll it again. These must go in your backup plan. So if you roll this face, remember the bones are not optional. So this die also has some very interesting faces. This one, for example, is Reflex. This is a lockable die face. And it says at the end of any turn in which you lose HP, you can move up to 2 positions, and this lasts the entire adventure. So there will be turns on which you lose HP, either because Static hurts himself, because he has a bleed effect, a number of different things. But this will let you move a little bit extra. This also allows you to do something where maybe you attack a baddie, but because you lost HP on that turn, you can then move away from that baddie and give yourself a little bit of space. There's also a different lockable die face on here, so you're going to have to choose, called Like a Butterfly. And this one says that once per turn at the start of your turn, you can spend 1 inner piece to move up to 2 positions. So this one goes into effect at the start of your turn, but it gives you extra movement in exchange for, giving up a little bit of that inner piece. So that is Obendar Flow. And the die that comes after it is Shalefist Pivot, which we're going to go ahead and talk about first just to go to the end of the line, So this die, Shalefist Pivot, has no bones faces. It just has variations of this symbol with 1s, 5s, or 20s next to them. And these are going to correspond to point values on baddies that you could face in battle. So what Shalefist Pivot means is that you swap positions with any baddie with the number of points printed on the die or less. Then you can deal that baddie 1 true damage. So it lets you swap with a baddie of a certain point value. You deal 1 true damage to that baddie. And then you can actually add +2 true damage for each electrified baddie that is in the battle, not necessarily the one that you hit. So what that means is that if you're using your Knuckle Zappers to great effect and then you throw this die in there, you can do even more damage just because there are electrified baddies out there on the battle mat, which is super cool. So that is Shalefist Pivot. Next, let's talk about this little branch. We've got Ebonite Throw. As one might expect, there are a couple of bones faces on here, but there's also something cool you can do with your defense. All the other die faces are going to have this symbol with a value of 1, 2, or 3 printed in the bottom left corner. And what Ebonite Throw lets you do is remove up to the number of defense printed on the die from your target and then deal damage to them equal to the defense removed. So basically, instead of having to chop through somebody's defense and then hurt them after that, you can remove their defense and then use that removed defense value to hurt them. So I mean, it's kind of like doing double damage. It's very interesting. So if you want to remove somebody's defenses and then use those to hurt them, Ebonite Throw is your die. So that is Ebonite Throw. And then we've also got Deepwood Rally. So this die has a couple of faces with 2 bones, a face with 3 bones, but it also has this very cool face for Deepwood Rally. And this is another lockable face. Remember that Static only has 2 lock slots, so you're going to have to make some difficult choices here. What Deepwood Rally lets you do is anytime you remove the last defense die from a baddie, then you heal for 1 HP, and it lasts the entire adventure. So by punching through someone's defenses, you help yourself. So that is Deepwood Rally, the last of Static's dice, and that basically covers all of his dice and his innate abilities. Let's go ahead and have a look at his backup plan. So as usual, Static's backup plan is going to mesh really well with his other skills. So for 1 bone, you can't do anything, but for 2, you can energize, and that means that you can increase your Knuckle Zappers by 1, and you're going to want to do that pretty often. For 3 bones, you can do a current shield, and that lets you place a defense 2 die in any Gearloc's active slot, so you can protect yourself or you can protect somebody else. For 4 bones, you can do vanish. That exhausts up to 4 attack and or defense dice from the supply. This does count against your stats, so you are sacrificing some of what you can do. But for each die exhausted, you can place an untargetable effect die on any Gearloc. So you're affecting how many attack and defense dice you can roll for the rest of this battle, but you're also helping to hide someone, potentially yourself. And then for 5 bones, we've got Overclock. That lets you place a stun effect die on an electrified baddie. So if you've already got a baddie who's electrified, you can put a stun effect on them, and that is a status effect that essentially causes them to lose their next turn. Then you do have to remove and exhaust its electrified chip, and it cannot be used for the remainder of the battle. So normally when you remove HP and expose an electrified chip, that chip returns to Static's prep area, and then he can deploy it again. However, if you overclock, that electrified chip remains out of the game for the remainder of the battle. And then for 6 bones, of course, you can do Innate +1, which makes Static a meditative master, which lets him roll 5 defense dice instead of 3 after the recovery phase to help store up some bones for that next battle. As for beginner build strategy, basically Static has low attack and dex, but he doesn't necessarily need them as much as you think, because don't forget he can use things like Inner Peace to generate dexterity. Even if only temporarily, he can have some massive turns. So you might want to invest heavily in defense with a little bit of dex and a little bit of HP, because Static can use his abilities to do a lot of other kinds of damage that aren't just attack dice. With skills, obviously you want to invest in skills that help you delay and stay alive while you build up these giant turns. So you want to get Perseverance very quickly. And then you also might want to get something in the Kinesiologist line and an early Sibron Style to help with your board control, because you're going to need to kind of flip around and kill time in order to build up. Also, definitely make sure you're paying attention to your Knuckle Zappers, because they do a lot on their own, and they also help out in combination with other skills. So that is Static. He's a relatively accessible Gearloc to play, and I think that once you get used to the whole Inner Peace thing, you'll be really, really impressed with what he's able to do. So thank you so much for watching. I'll be back very soon with another Gearloc guide, and most of all, happy gaming.